And here it is, the one we've all been waiting for. This is the battle of the brush, or our traditional watercolours, versus the brush pen, or our watercolour brush pens. In today's video, we're going to be doing a few things, a couple of sketches, and really just testing out these specific watercolour brush pens. These are Pro Markers by Winsor Newton. There's a reasonably big range of different colours, and we're going to explore, how can we really get them to work for us? For me, I've previously tried to use them a few times and always found them a little bit intense and very saturated. But with that, I experimented and had a play, and we're going to have a look today. Can we make them really work in a loose style? And how can we make them really work? Because don't want to give any spoilers, but actually, they can be pretty fun. So we can actually have a look here first at this silly little illustration. We've got our brush on one side and our brush pen on the other, clearly having a little bit of a fight. So with watercolours, we know what we're getting. We can be really loose. We can apply a lot of water. We can change the intensity of the colour. With our brush pen, we have these quite fine nibs. But if we play around a little bit, and if we do something fun and illustrative like this, you can see that actually this turned out all right. If we sort of look at the actual processes going on, then we can see that on the brush with the watercolour side, we're getting a lot more texture. On the other hand, the brush pens are getting these moments of magic because of the type of pigment they've got in. It just floats across the surface and it can just really spread incredibly quickly and create something really fun. So my first impressions on sort of reinvigorating my exploration of these kind of brush pens, this different way of doing watercolours, is that maybe we've actually got something here. Maybe we can have a little play. Maybe there's something we can do. So next, I think we should just pick up our pens and grab a few of these pens and test them out. Look at what their colours are like and look at what they can really do. Now you can see that if we literally just colour with them, we've got a couple of nibs. There's a brush nib and there's a sort of finer nib. And if we just colour with them, we get this really like super intense saturated colour. It doesn't matter really which one you use, they're all pretty saturated. There's a couple which aren't so saturated, they're a little bit more tame, a little bit more timid. But on the whole, we're getting this like punch of colour, not unlike using an alcohol pro marker or an alcohol ink marker. But this is the temptation that I think I've fallen into in the past, where we just go, oh, we've got these pens, we must, of course, draw with them. But there are a lot of other things that we can do. There's a lot of other different ways we can play with them. So first, instead of thinking, pens go on dry paper, what about pens go on wet paper? And then we can find actually there's a lot more interest happening and these things can have texture. There's also this idea of just being quick and being not forceful, but really just going for it with our pens and then our brush. So incorporating the traditional brush alongside the pen. And before you know it, actually we can start to move these around as long as we haven't let them dry forever. And even after they've dried for a while, they still move pretty well when we activate them with water. Now, I don't know this for a fact, but one of my suspicions is that inside these pens is similar pigment. We have similar pigments in them that I'm sure of, but to sort of actually exist within a pen and work, they must be much finer. So that means that they can feel a bit uncontrolled within water, or they can feel amazing in water. They can just float across the surface. There's a little bit of comparison we can do between that and watercolours. When we paint with watercolours, we get these textures, the brush pushes the pigment into the paper. We can kind of control what's going on. When we do this wet on wet with our brushes, we get this really kind of magical flowing effect. And I have seen a few artists use this before, and this is where I got my idea of like, I actually need to look into this, have a play a little bit more. So the next thing to do, we've sort of messed around with the pens, we've created splodges on the page and done a tiny swatch of a few of them. The next thing is let's actually do some sketching with them. We've got a couple of scenes that we can talk through and see what happens as we just go for it. So the line work, I'm going to zoom through today. Hopefully you can see my normal thing going on, really loose. Got my fountain pen. This is a I've almost forgotten what the fountain pen is now. It's a TWSBI Diamond 580 fountain pen, one of my favourites, despite not being able to remember the name. And inside is platinum carbon black ink. Really lovely ink, really black, really waterproof. Although you'll see later, I'm a little bit lazy. And so you do need to let these dry. I was too lazy to let it dry, and we got a little bit of ink leaking into our scene. But it all came out well in the end. All I do, find some really quick shapes. I've drawn this scene a few times, so I feel sort of confident dancing around it and just grabbing those shapes. And before long, we have our scene marked out. So now I don't want to fall into traps I've fallen into in the past. I want to know what I'm doing a little bit. So I'm going to do tiny swatches of the colours I'm using. And here I've got 3 different blues. I've got an indigo, cerulean blue, and I think what they call the mid blue. And here's our opportunity to paint wet in wet. Do something similar to a sky I would do with watercolours. You can immediately see that this pigment flows and floats much more evenly. So we don't get that dramatic interest, but we get a very flowing, sort of gentle feel to our sky. What we can do these little splatters into the sky, and suddenly it can come to life a bit. Now I want to swatch out another few colours here. So I've got a sort of orange and a brown, I think one's saddle brown, and just using these because these should, in theory, because they're orangey brown, they should neutralise with that brown, with that blue in the sky, and we should end up with something a little bit interesting. And this is where I sort of thought, you know what, we can probably do something with these that we can't do with watercolours. So we can probably start building in little details already. So with that in mind, I thought we can start just using them as pens and as watercolours. Another thing we can start doing is actually really being neat in how we apply shadows. So instead of just washing things over, suddenly we can use the penliness of these to allow the colours to be quite specific and place them in, deep shadows where we really want them. What I'm effectively doing through all of this is mixing on the page. So the problem with having a pen-like formula for your colours is that they're in pens. You have a fixed number of pens, fixed number of colours. You can't rub them together and make a mix. You can do clever things on paper or even on bits of plastic where you can use it kind of like a watercolour reservoir, but it just doesn't feel that fun to do for me. It's like, well, if you're doing that, just use watercolours. Just get some watercolours instead of carrying loads and loads of extra equipment. But if we let things get wet on the page, we can actually mix. They don't layer that well. I personally don't think they layer that well because they're very saturated, very intense. But with water, I did find, for example, in our church here, we can get quite a lovely blend between orange and yellow here, both quite warm on the yellow-orange spectrum, but quite a nice blend. And then we can sort of also, in quite a nice way, be so specific with our brush that we can avoid that blending process happening, which sometimes with watercolours, perhaps it's less easy to do. I mean, for someone a little bit lazy like me who likes to just jump around. Again, because we got that brush, we can be really specific and quick about popping in deep shadows and popping in punchy reds. So we can suddenly introduce contrast into a scene, which is possible with a traditional watercolour, but isn't always just as simple. It takes a little bit more care and attention. Again, when we've done this, it's perfectly possible to bring back a brush. And here we've got our brush, and with that brush, we can move these colours around. We can actually now use this page as a kind of reservoir of colour and use bits of colour that we've got on the page to create other bits of magic on the page, instead of having to paint every little bit and then pick up more paint and remix. And we just take our brush, we keep it wet, we keep moving it around, and we pick up bits of paint and create textures from the pigment, from the brushes, which is already on the page. I hope that made sense. Felt like I went into a bit of a rabbit warren there. And like that, actually, I'm quite enjoying this sketch. There's opportunities to do more silly things, splash with the brushes. I found that quite effective as well. It does produce quite a good splatter just if we run the brush quickly along the edge. And again, that brush now has picked up some colour, so I can use that to paint with. There is certainly a real punchy vibrancy to these colours. There is no getting away from that, I don't think. doesn't matter how much you try and mix and things, this is always going to be a medium which is a bit illustrative, a bit happy, a bit too unreal. But on the other hand, really punchy, really lovely, and really quick. So perhaps there is a good place for carrying these guys around. You could imagine that sketch I did with 6 or 7 pens, and it felt pretty good. It felt like something I could use out and about. We don't need as much water, it doesn't make as much mess, so maybe there is a really good place. Now the next thing, we started this off as a big battle, didn't we? And one thing I should point out is actually it's not really brush versus brush pen, is it? Because what I've discovered very quickly in this is that we need that brush to make the brush pens work. So I lied at the beginning of the video. It's not the brush versus brush pen, it's really the watercolors, the typical watercolors versus the novel, new, avant-garde watercolors. But what I wanted to do before writing off my watercolors, which obviously I'm not going to do, is see what happens with a really simple sketch if we get them to play together instead of fight, instead of having to use one or the other. So again, I'm not going to bore you with the line work today, but suffice to say, you can see it here as a speed sketch. It's just a very simple continuous line drawing, really simple, really easy, just flowing around the page. And what I wanted to do was give myself a structure to hang some colours off, and that is exactly what we're going to do. So now, as a little compare and contrast, let's do my normal sky. So I've got my water and my watercolours, a bit of lavender, a bit of ultramarine, and just pushing that around. Now hopefully something you can see here is that sky has more texture to it. It's definitely more interesting, and it's also more controlled because the water, I put it down, and then that pigment doesn't just flow everywhere. It sort of stays still. Compared to if we now move on and start doing the greenery. Let's do the greenery in these really punchy, vibrant pens. And look what happens when I touch in the pens to the water. They spread really quickly. But I thought, maybe if we're a little more forceful in places and we dry brush or dry brush pen in this case through it, maybe we can get some texture. And actually, again, because of the specificity, it turns out we can get some rather nice textures running through there as well. Now, one thing I'm very conscious I claimed in the last one was that it's much easier with a brush pen to be specific with colour. That's not necessarily true, is it? I'm just being lazy, not being specific with colour. If I use a nice flat brush, bit of Pyrrole Scarlet, I can light up these little farmhouses really easily. So brush pens have an easy way of creating these specific bunches of colour, but it's not to say that we can't just do the same with our normal watercolours as well. Of course it's not. Perhaps there's a fun sort of place for applying really specific bits of dark with these brush pens, so a bit of Payne's grey here, and we can sort of move it around quite nicely, little touches here and there, and create subtle shadows in quite specific places. And again, I actually really like that, and I think there is a easier way of being specific with these. I do think that it's not got that same traditional feel quite, but in small amounts I can't tell the difference as much as I'd love to pretend I can. I really can't. So we can sort of see, if we finish off this sketch, a little bit of extra texture in the sky. That's something which is much easier with watercolours and brush pens. That actually, this kind of works. There's all these different types of pen and brush and things going on, but you can't necessarily tell the difference. And I can't, when I look at it close up, I can't tell the difference. So I guess the thing at the end is who won the fight? Well, I'm going to let you decide. So what do you prefer, traditional watercolours or brush pens? Do you like mixing, or do you think brush pens are consigned to the sort of illustrative art cupboard for when we just want to paint bold and brush and, they haven't got that subtlety we need? If you enjoy this, do hit the subscribe button. It's an unbelievable support to just grow, get more people to see this, and leave a comment. Again, that is a great way to help more people find this channel, if you want people to find this channel, which I hope you do. If you got this far, then hopefully you're enjoying yourself. With that, I will see you in the next one. So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel because it makes me really, really happy. Thanks again.